Order, order. We start with questions to the Secretary of State for Scotland, John Stevenson.
Number 1, Mr. Speaker.
Secretary of State.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to pay tribute to 2 great Scots who have sadly died in recent days. Winnie Ewing blazed a trail for women in politics. She was admired by colleagues from all of Scotland's parties as one of the most important politicians of her generation. Our thoughts are with her friends and family, particularly her children, Fergus and Annabel. And also, with Craig Brown's passing on Monday, Scottish football has lost a true legend, held in high regard by players and fans across the country, and again our thoughts are with his loved ones. Mr. Speaker, I will turn to question number 1. I am encouraged by the resilience that the Scottish labour market has shown despite global issues still causing significant economic challenges. The latest official figures show that Scottish unemployment is close to a record low at 3.1%, and I welcome this fact.
John Stevenson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If we are to grow the Scottish economy as well as the national one, it is vital that we have a skilled workforce and the right levels of investment. It is also important for areas such as the borders between Scotland and England that we have the least friction in trade and labour market conditions. Would the Minister agree that politicians of all persuasions have a responsibility to ensure the maximum opportunities for whatever side of the border they live on, to ensure that we have the least amount of friction, particularly for those looking for employment?
Secretary of State.
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, I agree with my honourable friend. That is exactly why this government introduced the UK Internal Market Act. It's to protect frictionless trade across the United Kingdom. And on the matter of opportunities which my honourable friend raises, for those on whatever side of the border they live on, Mr. Speaker, it's a matter of some regret that Scotland is the highest taxed part of the United Kingdom.
Pete Wishart, Chair of the Select Committee.
Thank you ever so much, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State and I represent large rural constituencies with large hospitality and tourism sectors. Can he therefore name one benefit that ending freedom of movement has brought to the labour market in either of those sectors?
Secretary of State.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Scottish National Party like to blame everything on Brexit. But the fact is, for the last 2 years, we've had record immigration into the United Kingdom. That's a simple fact. Record immigration since record figures since immigration figures began.
David Mandel.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I had the pleasure and privilege to be elected to the Scottish Parliament in 1999 alongside Winnie Ewing. Undoubtedly an iconic figure of modern Scottish politics, from the Hamilton by-election to Madame Ecosse to the opening of the Scottish Parliament. I always found her to be kind, sympathetic to new members, and she always had the best stories. May she rest in peace. Does my right honourable friend agree that the one thing that will reduce confidence in the Scottish labour market is the prospect of another independence referendum, real or de facto?
Well,
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend's absolutely right. Of course it is. Business doesn't like uncertainty, and this constant harping on about independence is just causing uncertainty amongst business. And the reality is that the devolved administration in Scotland should focus on the things that it was set up to do, focus on education standards, focus on the health service, focus on drug deaths, focus on getting some ferries rather than trying to create the island clearances.
Julie Elliott.
Number 2, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With permission, I will answer questions 2, 4, 5, 7, 8 and 11 together. Originality of thought by the opposition parties as ever. The United Kingdom Government recognises the challenges facing households due to elevated costs of living, so has taken action to protect struggling families with the largest support package in Europe. UK-wide support to households to help with higher bills is worth £94 billion, or £3,300 per household on average.
Julia.
Thank you. Over the winter, too many have had to make the decision on whether to heat or eat. In fact, too many couldn't afford to do either. With food inflation well in excess of 15%, with specific staple items much higher, people simply can't afford to eat. What advice does the Minister have for households in Scotland and in Sunderland, where I represent, who are worried about being able to provide food for their families?
Mr Speaker, of course, inflation is a problem affecting many Western economies, particularly those in Europe, and it's right that this government continues to provide cost of living support while sticking to our plan to avoid adding unnecessary inflationary pressures. The average household in Scotland receives £1,850 from the UK government, with the poorest household receiving £2,445. Now, around £5.2 billion was spent in 2022-23, which was more than the entire annual Scottish Government's welfare budget.
Which, Mr Speaker, with 13 consecutive hikes in interest rates, the IFS have warned that 1.4 million mortgage holders could face a 20% fall in disposable income. This mortgage crisis started with a disastrous Tory mini-budget last September, and it is adding to the cost of living crisis. So can the Secretary of State or his Minister please explain what the hell his party are doing to clean up the mess they have created?
Minister.
Mr Speaker, well, we do not accept the analysis of the honourable member. We recognise this is a concerning time for homeowners and mortgage holders, but we cannot ignore the fact that interest rates have risen across Western economies as a result of the pandemic and the impact of the war in Ukraine. The Government remains committed to responsible economic management to bring inflation back under control, which is the only way to achieve sustainably lower interest rates and mortgage rates.
Peter Grant.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It's not just homeowners that are affected by spiralling interest rates. They also contribute to an average rent increase of over 8%. The Scottish Government are doing their bit using the limited powers they have. They've extended the rent cap. They've extended the evictions freeze until March, so nobody in Scotland will be thrown out of the house because they're poor. And of course in Scotland, thanks to SNP, we're not selling off council houses, we're building more of them. What exactly is his government doing to protect tenants in Scotland and prevent an increase in homelessness?
Minister.
Mr Speaker, I thank the honourable gentleman for his question. I know that the honourable member has recently announced that he will be standing down at the next election, and whilst he and I clearly do not agree politically, I recognise that over his 8 years of service to the people of Glenrothes is worthy of recognition. As I said previously, tackling inflation is this government's priority, which is the best way of supporting mortgage holders and also those people who rent accommodation.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Is the Minister aware of the recent YouGov survey commissioned by Feeding Britain, which shows in May almost 1 in 6 adults in Scotland reported that they or someone in their household had accessed food aid in the previous 3 months?
Shocking.
Does the Minister now not agree it's now time for the Government to launch a food poverty strategy? And will he support the principles outlined in my private member's bill to end food bank use by 2030?
Mr Speaker, this United Kingdom Government remains absolutely committed to supporting the most vulnerable in society during these difficult times, and that is evidenced by providing support to those people who need it most. For example, over £137.5 billion to those pensioners on benefits, £67.9 billion on benefits to support disabled people and people living with health conditions, and a further £114.3 billion on working age and children welfare benefits. On top of that, from April, we've also seen an uprating of benefits and state pensions by 10.1%. This government is taking the action most required to support those people in most need and reject the analysis that he makes that this government is doing nothing.
Thank you,
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Under the last Labour government, absolute child poverty levels in Scotland fell from 40% in 1997 to 20% in 2007. However, that has all but been reversed. The SNP are not on track to meet their own goal of lowering child poverty to under 10% by 2030. You can shout, but there's a reason why the members there may be doing that. Right, so what steps is the government taking to ensure that child poverty levels return to the low levels last seen under the last Labour government?
Minister.
Mr Speaker, the Honourable Lady is right to highlight the failures of the Scottish Government, and by their reaction they don't like when they are challenged. They try and shout and heckle and shut down any contrary argument. As I've said before, this Government remains absolutely committed to supporting the most vulnerable in society and will continue to support all parts, whether they be children, householders or anyone else who needs support during the pressures of the cost of living.
Alan Brown.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Last year, £4.2 billion of balancing costs was added to our energy bills. This means paying wind farm operators to turn off their turbines and at the same time paying gas operators to fire theirs up due to grid constraints and a lack of storage. However, pump storage hydro schemes in Scotland could create 15,000 jobs and lower bills. So why is this government not fighting tooth and nail to get contractual arrangements in place to get these schemes up and running?
Mr Speaker, in relation to the cost of living, which is the theme for this question, the energy price guarantee will save households £160 for the period until July and brings the total government support for energy bills to £1,500 for typical households since October 2022. We're also ending a premium that over 4 million households in the UK pay for their prepayment meters, bringing their charges into line with comparable customers who pay by direct debits. This government is absolutely committed to supporting those people facing pressures under the cost of living.
Mr Speaker, I know the Prime Minister and the Government is entirely focused on helping people deal with the pressures of the cost of living. However, the SNP's government focus seems to be elsewhere. As we've seen this last weekend, the First Minister announced that the next election would entirely be focused on yet another independence referendum. Does the Minister agree with me that this is the wrong priority for Scotland and that Scotland's two governments should be working together to better deliver public services and help people with the cost of living?
Minister.
Mr Speaker, my honourable friend is absolutely right. Both of Scotland's governments, the UK Government and the Scottish Government, should be focused on delivering better public services and supporting people through the cost of living. And instead we hear the SNP cheering about another independence referendum. This government remains focused on delivering for the people of Scotland. I'm just sad the SNP government in Edinburgh failed to do so.
We now come to Shadow Secretary of State Ian Murray.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I join the Secretary of State from earlier in paying tribute to Winnie Ewing and Craig Brown, who both passed last week. I hold Craig Brown personally responsible for moments of complete unbridled joy and total heartbreak. They will both be sadly missed. And can I also wish the Secretary of State a happy birthday, a significant birthday for next week, Mr Speaker. Whoever shouted 80 from the back benches isn't far away from his age next week, so happy birthday to him. Mr Speaker, nearly 5 months ago, the Secretary of State promised a meeting for David Williamson, a Scottish terminal cancer patient, and neither his department or the Secretary of State for Health has been able to arrange that. I wonder if we could get that sorted as soon as possible. Mr Speaker, millions of people across the country are facing spiralling mortgage rates and rents. Statistics from Citizens Advice this week alone show that Scottish mortgage holders searching for advice on repossession is up 341%. So does the Minister agree with the insightful advice from the Prime Minister that worried mortgage payers who are hit by a Tory mortgage premium should just hold their nerve?
Mr Speaker, in relation to the right honourable gentleman's comments about David Williamson, I can confirm the Scotland Office did write to the Department for Health about this case, and I will undertake to ensure that we pursue that moving forward. In relation to mortgage rates, the Government recognises that this is a very concerning time for homeowners and mortgage holders, but we cannot ignore the fact that interest rates have risen across Western economies as a result of the pandemic and the impact of the war in Ukraine. Of course, the Bank of England sets the base rate, which has an effect on mortgage pricing, and as the honourable member will remember, it was the Labour government that made the bank independent of government. As the honourable member will also know, the Chancellor has agreed with the mortgage lenders just of last week there will be a new mortgage charter which will hopefully provide some protection and reassurance to mortgage holders.
The Scotland Office is saying that Scottish mortgage holders should just hold their nerve, and what the Minister didn't say in his whole list of excuses that the Tories actually crashed the economy, which is the result of some of these mortgage interest rates. Isn't it incredible that in the worst cost of living crisis in living memory, the Prime Minister's entire approach is to tell people to hold their nerve, and the First Minister's approach in Scotland is to launch proposals for a de facto referendum and a written constitution, something he admits himself Scottish voters don't want. Scotland has two governments so out of touch with the priorities of the Scottish people that polling shows 70% think they are doing little to help with the cost of living. So does the Minister agree with me that what Scots need and deserve is a UK Labour government solely focused on delivering the priorities of Scottish voters?
Mr Speaker, this United Kingdom government is very clear that now is not the time for another independence referendum. But Mr Speaker, the Labour Party so often end up backing the SNP policy after policy in Scotland. Mr. Speaker, since we're approaching the summer holidays, perhaps Keir Starmer should take his flip-flops and see if there's space in the SNP's camper van.
We now come to SNP spokesperson, Dr. Philippa.
Thank you very much, Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. If I could thank the Secretary of State for his kind words about Winnie Ewing and Craig Brown, and obviously pay my own personal tribute to Winnie Ewing, who was such an icon for our party and almost uniquely served in 3 parliaments, our own Madam Ecosse. Food inflation in the UK at over 19% is 50% higher than among our EU neighbours. Yet both the Government and Labour Party seem to be in complete denial about Brexit's contribution to this cost-of-eating crisis. With 28% of the UK's food coming from Europe, how will his government prevent a new surge in food prices next winter when extra checks, post-Brexit checks, are introduced at the border?
Mr. Speaker, as the Chancellor has said, food price inflation has been a problem in many parts of Europe. In Germany, Sweden, Portugal and Poland, food price inflation is around 20%. So this is not a UK-only problem. This government is doing everything they can to deal with Putin's invasion in Ukraine and the aftermath of the pandemic. And we're also tackling one central focus, which is bringing inflation down and ensuring that that is this government's one priority.
Dr. Philippa.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The London School of Economics shows that a third of food inflation in the UK is due to Brexit. But also with the loss of freedom of movement and European workers, Brexit has also caused £60 million of Scottish fruit and veg to rot in the fields, threatening farms and further increasing the cost of even domestic produce. As a Brexiteer, shouldn't the Secretary of State apologise to the Scottish public, including his own constituents, for driving up food prices, and maybe explain why he still supports the proven liar who was one of its main architects?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we do not accept SNP's analysis. And as I've already explained, food inflation is an issue in many parts of Europe. I think it's a bit rich for the SNP member to be raising food price inflation and rising costs, especially when leaked papers this morning revealed that SNP ministers in Edinburgh are discussing raising council tax by up to 22.5%, meaning that some people will end up paying £751 more a year. Under the SNP in Scotland, local government funding has been gutted, forcing councils to slash local services and impose large tax hikes. I will take no lessons from the honourable member about bringing prices down for households in Scotland.
Jim Wakeford.
Question 3, Mr. Speaker.
Tuesday.
Mr. Speaker, the United Kingdom is the most successful political and economic union in the world, the foundation on which all our businesses and citizens are able to thrive. When we work collaboratively as one United Kingdom, we are safer, stronger and more prosperous. We are better able to draw on the institutions that unite us, like the health service, the armed forces and our world-class education system, and better able to respond to challenges such as supporting families with the cost of living and leading the international response to Russia's illegal war in Ukraine.
Christian Wakeford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Secretary of State think that a former Prime Minister fined by the police, subsequently to have found to have knowingly lied to both the late Queen, this House and therefore the public, to have strengthened or weakened the Union?
Well, I say to the honourable gentleman, the union has never been stronger. What we know is this Prime Minister has said that those in public life should aspire to the highest standards of propriety.
Can I ask my right honourable friend, has he seen the video released by the Scottish Government in which Cabinet Secretary Angus Robertson makes a range of spurious claims about devolution being under attack by the UK Government, and what has he thought of it?
Tuesday.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I did see Angus Robertson's video clip, and I think I counted 16 false claims in the space of 1 minute and 40 seconds. That's a false claim every 6 seconds, Mr. Speaker. Pretty impressive, even by his standards. So, as usual, it's the nationalists who are desperate to invent a grievance. But the reality is it's the UK government that respects devolution, We support devolution. We strengthen devolution. The only people who want to destroy devolution are the ones who want to rip us out of the United Kingdom.
Shadow Minister Chris Elmore.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Privileges Committee's conclusions were crystal clear that the former Prime Minister knowingly misled this House and then subsequently tried to intimidate the very committee he set up. Why did the Secretary of State not set an example and vote for the Privileges Committee's report?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as I've said to the media last week when I was interviewed and this question was raised, very simply because I felt the report was too excessive in its conclusions.
Alexander Stafford.
Question 6, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, Scotland's energy industry is vital to supporting the UK's energy security. This government has listened to Scotland's energy industry and understands the need to encourage industry investment. That is why we've recently announced the Energy Security Investment Mechanism, which removes the energy profits levy if oil and gas prices fall to normal levels for a sustained period prior to March 2028.
Alexander Stafford.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It was great to hear a cheer for the Secretary of State as he stood up. Now, I'm sure my right honourable friend would agree with me that hydrogen production will be vital to meeting both the UK's energy needs and also our net zero target in the future. Can my right honourable friend set out what the UK government is doing to promote the development and production of hydrogen in Scotland?
Yes, I thank my honourable friend for that question. Mr. Speaker, low-carbon hydrogen is critical to delivering energy security. It presents a significant growth opportunity and it will help the UK reach net zero. And we've doubled our ambition up to 10 gigawatts of low-carbon hydrogen production capacity by 2030, and at least half of this will come from electrolytic hydrogen, drawing on the scale-up of the UK offshore wind, other renewables and, of course, new nuclear.
McKay.
Will the discussions with the Scottish Government also include the problems with National Grid transmission, which mean National Grid are paying to turn off wind turbine production because they can't afford to get it to the south of the country?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I say to the Honourable Senator, by law, the transmission network charging is a matter for Ofgem, who are an independent regulator. They have recently produced a report on charging reforms, and the government is looking at that.
Elaine Saxby.
Question 9, please, Mr. Speaker.
Secretary of State.
Mr. Speaker, whilst forestry is a devolved policy, we continue to work with the devolved administrations to deliver a UK-wide step change in tree planting and establishment.
Saxby.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last year, 50% of forestry planting was much-needed productive forestry for our construction and manufacturing industries. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that there should now be a new UK-wide target that aims for 60% of new planting to be productive, allowing Scotland to lead the way for the rest of the UK?
Mr. Speaker, I know that my honourable friend is a champion for this industry. It is the UK government's ambition to increase planting across the United Kingdom. And I know that she is very keen that that productive forestry is used to support construction and manufacturing industries, and that indeed is the government's ambition as well.
Dave Dugan.
Mr. Speaker, Scotland, like in so much else, leads the way in forestry and tree planting, with 10,000 hectares planting, fully 3/4 of all tree planting across these islands. Can the Secretary of State instruct the House on what championing he has done of Scotland's progress in this area around the Cabinet table, or is he too cowering?
Well, not only do I champion it, Mr. Speaker, I also plant trees myself.
Wendy Chamberlain.
Mr. Speaker, almost 90,000 food parcels were given to children in Scotland last year, and the trend.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With permission, I'll answer questions 10 and 14 together. This government is committed to tackling child poverty and protecting the most vulnerable in society. In the recent budget, the Chancellor announced additional support measures for households and families across Scotland, and indeed across all parts of the United Kingdom. A further example of support for families was announced earlier today, with the UK government making childcare more affordable.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Almost Almost 90,000 food parcels were given to children in Scotland last year, and the Trussell Trust Hunger in Scotland report showed that single parents make up only 2% of the population, but 17% of those who have gone hungry. This is about insufficiency of income, but the adult rate of benefits should be restored to single parents under 25 on universal credit. There's a practical way for the UK Government to support. Does the Minister agree?
Mr Speaker, I recognise the work that the Honourable Lady undertakes with the APPG on food banks. We are protecting, the Government are protecting the most vulnerable with a £94 billion support package for households, and have helped nearly 2 million people out of absolute poverty after housing costs since 2010.
Christine Jardine.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My constituency of Edinburgh West is not amongst the poorest in Scotland. Well, we already have 1 in 10 children, in some areas 1 in 3 children, living in poverty. 2/3 of them, their families, are actually working. So with the soaring food prices, sky-high mortgage rates, and Edinburgh having the highest increase in annual rents in the UK, families are struggling. We know that our Scottish Government is only interested in independence. So can the Minister tell me what the UK Government is going to do for those families?
Mr Speaker, the Government recognises the anxiety that people feel about rising mortgages. That's why the Prime Minister's priority is to halve inflation this year. That is the single best way that we can keep costs down and interest rates down for people, and we've got a clear plan to deliver that. The Chancellor also met with major mortgage lenders last week and has agreed a mortgage charter covering 75% of the market. Hopefully that will provide reassurance to mortgage holders and others affected by this.
Before we come to Prime Minister's questions, I'm sure the whole House will wish to join me in paying tribute to John Angeli, OBE, the Director of the Parliamentary Broadcasting, who is leaving the House service at the end of this week. During his 12 years as Director, John not only oversaw the expansion of live video coverage to all public proceedings, but delivered the hybrid capability which enabled Parliament to function during lockdown, and of course made history with President Zelensky beamed into this chamber. He has more recently brought live subtitling and British Sign Language to our proceedings. I am sure I speak on behalf of the whole House in thanking John and wishing him all the best in the future. We now start with questions to Prime Minister. Dr Luke Evans.
Number 1, Mr Speaker.
Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, today we'll see the second reading of the Holocaust Memorial Bill. For decades, survivors like the late Sir Ben Helfgott showed the extraordinary courage to share their testimonies so that we would never forget. I hope the whole House will unite today to get this memorial built and put those testimonies at the heart of our democracy for generations to come. Mr Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Dr Luke Evans.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And for 3 years since I've been elected, I've been campaigning to improve health facilities in my community. And I'm pleased to see significant investment in Leicestershire with £14 million for a CDC in Hinckley and part of £20 billion for hospital improvements for the LRI and Glenfield. But I'm looking for a hat-trick of health in Hinckley. And what I'm looking for is a day case unit. The money is already there. It's tied up in red tape. I've raised this with the Health Secretary. Would the Prime Minister look to see what he can do? And would he come and like to open the CDC next year in Hinckley?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr Speaker, I'm delighted that since its opening last month, the Hinckley CDC has already delivered, I believe, over 300 additional tests to the local community. My honourable friend will know that it's for the local health authorities to determine how to allocate the NHS budget in their area, but I have no doubt that he will continue to make the case for them for a day case unit in his community.
We now come to the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Mr Speaker, can I join your tribute to John and wish him all the best on behalf of the House, and join the Prime Minister in his comments about the Holocaust Memorial. I'd also like to wish Muslims across the country a happy Eid. And Mr Speaker, last week the Labour Party lost Margaret McDonough, our first female General Secretary, and a trailblazer in every sense of the word. Margaret provided guidance, leadership and loyal friendship to so many in the Labour movement. And it wasn't long after I started in this job that Margaret was at my door. and I will be forever grateful for the advice and support that she gave me. We will all miss her terribly. Yeah. Mr. Speaker, his party spent thousands of pounds on adverts attacking plans to build 300,000 new homes a year. At the same time, his housing minister says it's Tory party policy to build 300,000 new homes a year. So is he for building 300,000 new homes a year or against it?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I can just remind the honourable gentleman of our record since being in office. 2.2 million additional homes, Mr. Speaker. Housing starts double the number we inherited from the Labour Party. More homes meeting the decent home standards. Housing supply up 10% in the last year that we have figures for. And in the last year we had figures for, we also saw a 20-year high in the number of first-time buyers, Mr. Speaker. That's a Conservative government delivering for this country.
Mr. Speaker, it wasn't a difficult question. Can he point to a single person in housing, in construction, anywhere, who thinks he'll actually hit his target of 300,000 new homes a year? Anyone?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the record is that in the last 3 years, we've delivered almost record numbers of new home building in every one of those years. But Mr. Speaker, he talks about targets, so let's be clear. I promised to put local people in control of new housing. I delivered on that policy within weeks of becoming Prime Minister. But I am confused from the honourable gentleman, because first, the Shadow Community and Housing Secretary said communities should have control. But then he said we should get the targets back and disempower local people. I do want to give him some advice. I don't think it's local people that are the problem. It's a Labour Party policy.
Mr. Speaker, presumably if he could have identified a single person who thought he'd hit his target, he would have told us. And there you have the problem. 1 minute he says he's for building new houses, the next he's campaigning against them. And the truth is, far from delivering, since he crumbled to his backbenchers and scrapped mandatory targets, house building has collapsed. He knows it, they know it, and every expert is telling them it. Why didn't he just admit it? He's not going to get anywhere near his target, is he?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman now claims that he supports house building, especially on the green belt. But unfortunately for him, it's good that he agrees that he does believe that now. But unfortunately for him, the Shadow Deputy Prime Minister, the Shadow Minister for Women, the Shadow Health, Justice, Defence, Business, Northern Ireland and Scotland ministers are all united against more house building in their areas, Mr. Speaker. I have to say to them, though, Mr. Speaker, I would say to them, though, they don't have to worry too much because he's never actually kept a promise he's made.
Mr. Speaker, you can tell from his answer, non-answer, and his body language, he's actually given up. He's given up. And his failure isn't just shattering the dream of those who desperately want to own their own home, it's also hitting those who already have a mortgage. Because of their economic chaos, mortgage holders will be £2,900 a year poorer. How can they ever look the British people in the eye again and claim to be the party of home ownership?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I don't think he's noticed that his Shadow Housing Secretary doesn't actually agree with his new policy of concreting over the green belt, Mr. Speaker. She's been campaigning against developments in her own constituency. She said she wanted to prevent urban sprawl and provide green space for local people. I think that's quite sensible, but it's classic Labour, Mr. Speaker, saying one thing here, doing another thing elsewhere. You simply can't trust a word they say.
At least he isn't claiming they are the party of home ownership anymore, because we are. Mr. Speaker, she's given up. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister says he's 100% on it. But his definition of 100% on it is to gently ask the banks to do the right thing. His softly approach, refusing to put mandatory measures in place, risks leaving 1 million households without support. how many will have to lose their homes before he'll stand up for the people his party have pushed into economic misery?
Mr. Speaker, in fact, the vast majority of the mortgage market is now covered by the new mortgage charter that the Chancellor's brought in. That is delivering practical help to mortgage holders, allowing them to extend their terms, switch to interest-only mortgage, and actually saving them hundreds of pounds a month. So instead of scaring them, actually, there is now practical support in place. But it's right that he raised home ownership, Mr. Speaker. That's why we, on this side of the House, introduced a 95% mortgage guarantee scheme. It's why we introduced the first homes and shared ownership schemes to get people onto the housing ladder. And crucially, Mr. Speaker, it's why we cut stamp duty. So now what we've seen is the highest number of first-time buyers in 20 years, Mr. Speaker. That is twice the number that the Labour Party ever managed.
Mr. Speaker, it's sort of housing crisis, what crisis with this Prime Minister? He must be the only person in the country who thinks that enough houses have been built in the last 13 years. And whether it's those dreaming of getting the keys to their first home or those already with mortgages, the ambitions of families across the country have been crushed by his failing Tory government. House building at its lowest rate since the war because he can't stand up to his own party. A Tory mortgage bombshell because they crashed the economy. Millions left without support because he won't make lenders put families first. Rather than lecturing the rest of the country on holding their nerve, why doesn't he try and locate his?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as always, he hasn't actually taken the time to understand the detail of what we're doing. So, again, I'm happy to explain it again, Mr. Speaker, because it's right that we provide support for mortgage owners, which is why we improve the generosity of the support for mortgage interest scheme. It's why we've introduced a new mortgage charter, which, by the way, goes much more farther than the Labour Party policy on protecting mortgage holders does. On house building, we're proud to protect the green belt and invest millions more in developing brownfield sites. But, Mr. Speaker, the simple truth is, that's what I said I would do, and that's what we've delivered, and that is the difference between us. I deliver what I promise, he just breaks his.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Labour-run Kirklees Council's local plan is seeing hundreds of homes built on greenfield sites, but the agreed developer levies, the Section 106 agreements, which are supposedly for local infrastructure spending, seem to be disappearing into a black hole. So does the Prime Minister agree with me that agreed infrastructure levies from developers shouldn't be going into a general slush fund? They should be spent on local roads, local schools and local health services for the communities impacted by those developments.
My honourable friend raises an excellent point, and that's why the government is reforming the Section 106 payment system to ensure that new development is matched by new infrastructure, because the current system sees far too little of the developers' profits going to build new schools, hospitals or transport infrastructure. It's also too slow and plagued by uncertainties, and that particularly hampers smaller local developers. So it will be replaced by a new non-negotiable, local determined infrastructure levy, which will deliver exactly what the honourable gentleman and others want to see: investment in local communities.
SNP leader Stephen Flynn.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to start by paying tribute to SNP legend Winnie Ewing and Scotland men's national team former manager Craig Brown, who both so sadly passed in recent days, and to all Muslims who are celebrating Eid Mubarak. Mr. Speaker, on Sunday the Prime Minister patronised the public when he told them that in the face of ever-increasing mortgage bills that they simply need to hold their nerve. What a nerve. So may I ask him, the near billionaire, when was the last time that he struggled to pay a bill?
Mr. Speaker, The reason that mortgage rates are rising is because of inflation, Mr. Speaker. That is the root cause, which is why it's absolutely the right policy to tackle, halve inflation and reduce it back to target. Now, that does mean that we do have to make difficult decisions. It does mean we have to be patient while the impact of those decisions actually has an impact. But in the meantime, Mr. Speaker, as I was explaining previously, we are taking practical steps to support mortgage holders across the United Kingdom, particularly through the SMI scheme and the new mortgage charter.
Stephen Flynn.
Mr. Speaker, that answer confirms what we already know, that this Prime Minister is out of touch and the Tory party is soon to be out of time. And what the public really want is change. But in a week where the Conservative Party and indeed the Labour Party both refuse to accept proposals for public sector pay rises, whilst at the same time accepting the economic damage of Brexit, is it not the case that Westminster does not offer the people real change nor real hope for the future?
Prime Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman just exposes the complete economic illiteracy of the SNP's position. His first question talks about the challenges posed on ordinary families by higher interest rates caused by higher inflation. What does his next question do? Support a policy that would increase government borrowing and make the situation worse. Mr. Speaker, it just demonstrates completely candidly why the SNP's approach to economic management is simply not fit for anyone in the United Kingdom.
Mr. Speaker, local police stations are a key part of communities such as Aldridge in my constituency, and that's why I continue to make the case to Labour's Police and Crime Commissioner to save and strengthen the role of Aldridge Police Station, not force it to close. So does the Prime Minister agree with me that any such closure would be reckless, and Police and Crime Commissioners should be working with local communities and local police teams to provide greater certainty, particularly given the extra 1,376 extra police officers this government has put into the West Midlands?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to hear about the extra police officers that the government has funded in my right honourable friend's community, but I am concerned to hear about the planned closure of Aldridge Police Station. I'd like to thank my right honourable friend for raising such an important issue. I know it's one on which she is championing her constituents. As she will know, unfortunately, this is a decision of the locally elected Labour Police and Crime Commissioner, and I would join her in urging them to think again.
Liz Savile-Roberts.
The Prime Minister's solution to inflation is to push families into poverty while letting corporate profits pile up. Absolutely. Economic illiteracy. The IMF said this week that the way to cut inflation is for companies to cut their profit margins. It's corporate greed fueling inflation, not workers' need for fair pay. Can he explain to the 1 in 5 people in Wales facing hunger because they cannot afford to buy decent food why they must pay his price for lowering inflation?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, actually, my honourable friend the Chancellor met with all the economic regulators this morning, and they'll be making an announcement later about their plans to ensure fairness of pricing and supply chain to ease the burden on consumers. But I'm glad she brought up the IMF when it comes to tackling inflation, because actually the IMF, in their words, strongly endorsed our plan to halve inflation, and they called our steps both decisive and responsible.
Jonathan Lord.
Mr. Speaker, as my right honourable friend knows, I've been liaising closely with the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities and with the Treasury with regard to the terrible news of Woking Council's recent Section 114 notice. Would my right honourable friend agree with me that in this scenario, the vulnerable must be protected and that the local councillors of all parties need to work together to try to put the council's finances back on the right track?
Prime Minister.
I know my honourable friend is a great champion for his Woking residents, and as he knows, the Secretary of State for Levelling Up has intervened in this authority and appointed commissioners to ensure that decisions are taken that provide the best outcomes for residents, including the most vulnerable and indeed the public purse. I agree with him that local councillors should be working together with the commissioners to put the council's finances in order. The commissioners will submit their first report to the Secretary of State, setting out progress on the Council's path to improvement and financial sustainability, and I look forward with him to seeing further progress.
Sir Christopher Bryant.
Thank you.
The Prime Minister has had responsibility for the UK economy now for 1,323 days, and he's delivered. He's delivered the largest national peacetime debt ever, the largest tax burden since the Second World War, the highest core inflation since 1991, the fastest interest rate rises since 1989, and the biggest fall in living standards in our history. So will he stop lecturing my constituents about holding their nerve, ditch the lame excuses, and admit that he is literally the worst person to be leading this country through a cost of living crisis?
Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, again, what do we hear from the party opposite? Only ideas that would make the situation far worse, Mr. Speaker. It's as simple as that. The honourable gentleman has sat there and supported plans to borrow tens of billions of pounds more. That would make inflation worse. The honourable gentleman has sat there and said that we should not stand up to unaffordable union pay demands. That would make the situation worse. And the honourable gentleman has sat there and supported plans to not exploit our domestic sources of energy, Mr. Speaker, imperiling our energy security. Those are all things that would make not just the situation worse for British families today, but for years into the future, and that's why this Conservative government will keep doing the right thing to support them.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituents rely on many nearby hospitals. Milton Keynes, where this government has committed to a new women and children's hospital. Stoke Mandeville, who has just completed the build of a new children's A&E. But also Wickham, where infrastructure and maintenance issues in the ageing tower is preventing around 2,000 operations a year from going ahead. My local trust has a plan for a £200 million new clinical centre at Wickham Hospital. Will my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, work with myself and Buckinghamshire colleagues to make that a reality?
Prime Minister. Well, I thank my honourable friend for his question. Whilst he knows that we are no longer inviting further schemes to join the new hospital programme, I can tell him that in the future new schemes will be considered through the rolling programme of capital investment in hospital infrastructure. That will secure the building of new hospitals beyond 2030 and mean future investment to upgrade the NHS estate across the country. Now, future plans for that will obviously be set out in spending reviews and fiscal events, but in the meantime, I know that he will continue to make the passionate case for Wickham Hospital, and I join him in that.
Chris Elman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Hundreds of steel workers are outside Parliament today, and some are in the gallery, calling on the Prime Minister to act now to back our vital steel industry before it is too late. So will he confirm today that he will match the ambition of the Labour Party and our international competitors to deliver competitive energy prices, invest in green steel production, use UK steel in our procurement systems, and protect us from dirty steel imports by introducing climate measures? And when will he get on with protecting and supporting the industry?
Mr. Speaker, we're proud to support the steel industry and value the contribution that it makes to this country, which is why we've put in place the Energy Intensive Industry Scheme that provides hundreds of millions of pounds of support to steel companies with their energy bills. We've also introduced the Industrial Energy Transformation Fund so that companies can apply for capital grants to help them with the transition. We are taking forward plans in the Treasury for carbon border adjustment mechanisms to ensure a level playing field, and it's why, Mr. Speaker, during the pandemic, that I stepped in to support financially a steel company in Wales.
Sir James Duddridge.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Despite 5 years of lobbying, sadly the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association International branch will leave the United Kingdom. Mr. Speaker, you know this is a great concern to the House, although perhaps something a little niche for our constituents. It is important. They need special status. The government haven't granted that by way of a short bill or an amendment to an existing bill. And could the Prime Minister at this late stage, this month, do something about this? Because otherwise they'll be gone, never to come back.
Prime Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, the United Kingdom values the work of the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association. My right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, has made clear that he does not want the CPA International to relocate. He's written to them in March to confirm that officials from the SCDO would work with the CPA to find a mutually acceptable solution to the status issue, and I look forward to seeing progress.
Alison McGovern.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, your constituents and mine, I think, have been made a promise by the Prime Minister. Inflation at or below 5% by the end of this year. So I want to ask the Prime Minister, what will happen if he fails to meet that promise? Will it be yet more ranting on about the Labour Party, or will it be the general election my constituents crave?
No, Mr. Speaker, we are sticking to the course of bringing inflation down, Mr. Speaker. I think what the Labour Party need to understand is that requires making difficult and tough decisions, Mr. Speaker. It requires prioritising. It requires being able to say no when people come asking you to borrow more money. Those are the type of responsible decisions that I will make and the Conservative government will make because they're the right ones for the country.
Maybe more.
Mr. Speaker, for over 160 years, Southport Pier has been at the centre of our visitor economy, welcoming visitors from far and wide, including Chorley, Mr. Speaker. It stood the tests of time, except for the mismanagement of Labour-controlled Sefton Council, who've closed our pier. Businesses are concerned it will have a huge impact on tourism. Will the Prime Minister condemn these actions and support my campaign and efforts to work with this Conservative government to get our pier open?
Mr. Speaker, can I welcome my honourable friend's commitment to the important community assets in his constituency, such as the historic Grade 2 listed Southport Pier. And I am pleased to say that he is working and succeeded in getting the government to provide £2 million as part of the Coastal Community Fund to undertake improvements in the pier. And that's alongside the landmark £35.5 million town deal for Southport, which is the second largest town deal anywhere in the country.
Samantha Dixon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is the first opportunity that I've had to put a question to the Prime Minister for the residents of the City of Chester. So, why does the Prime Minister think it's acceptable for sewage to be pumped into the beautiful River Dee that flows through Chester for the next 27 years?
Mr. Speaker, of course it's not acceptable, and that's why this government has gone further than any other government in tackling this issue, committing to monitor 100% of storm overflows, an investment programme of £56 billion to upgrade infrastructure, and enshrining in law strict targets, as well as introducing unlimited fines for water companies. But when it came to talking about those policies in this House, the party opposite couldn't even be bothered to turn up and vote for them.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Later today, Parliament will welcome apprentices from around the UK who were working in the aerospace industry. And I'm very much looking forward to meeting Callum and Brittany, who are both apprentices in my constituency of Wolverhampton North East at Collins Aerospace. Would he join me in celebrating apprenticeships in the aerospace industry and encourage colleagues to attend and meet their apprentices?
Well, can I join with my honourable friend in both celebrating everyone doing an apprentice and encourage everyone to go and meet theirs later on today and pay tribute to Callum and Brittany in particular. And she's absolutely right to highlight the importance of the aerospace industry, particularly because of our new defence cooperation agreement with Italy and Japan to build a new generation of fighter aircraft. Thousands of new jobs will be created across the country. Many of those will be through apprentices, and that's an example of this Conservative government providing opportunities for the next generation.
Mr. Speaker, Prime Minister, last year 1.7 million children missed more than 10% of their schooling. 125,000 children were absent more than they were in school, and a further 140,000 children were missing from formal schooling completely. This is both a safeguarding and an educational catastrophe, and it is happening on the Prime Minister's watch. Yesterday, the Schools Minister told the Education Select Committee that primary legislation was required to initiate a national register for children missing from education so we can find out where they are. Will the Prime Minister commit to bringing forward necessary legislation to combat this crisis for our children as a matter of urgency?
Prime Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, I agree with the honourable gentleman that children missing school is a tragedy and it's incredibly damaging for educational outcomes, which is why during the pandemic and afterwards we invested £5 billion to help children catch up with lost learning. It's important that we continue to deliver on those plans, and we will of course make sure that we work with the sector to have more children attending school more often.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Economic recovery and reconstruction will be vitally important to Ukraine when it comes to rebuilding a free and sovereign nation. So will my right honourable friend help galvanise the expertise of our UK's private sector to help strengthen Ukraine's recovery and their economic prospects after this devastating war?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, time and time again, Ukraine has shown its ability to rapidly harness innovation and creativity, and I know that its economic recovery will be no different. And my right honourable friend is absolutely right to highlight that private sector expertise and investment will be critical to that recovery. And I was pleased that over 400 world-leading companies pledged to back Ukraine's reconstruction at the very successful recovery conference that the UK hosted the other week. We're doing our part as well, Mr. Speaker, with a $3 billion World Bank loan guarantee on top of all the other investment that we've put in place. And I think what the conference showed is that there's enormous momentum across the world to support Ukraine's recovery, and that recovery and ambition is being led by the United Kingdom.
Janet David.
Mr. Speaker, a university student in Lewisham East has seen her rent rise by £200 a month due to the mortgage rate increases. She is now at risk of homelessness and she can't return to the family home. She has no choice but to use food banks, even though she has 2 part-time jobs. Not only is she falling behind in her studies, she's falling further into debt and she's falling into depression. What does the Prime Minister say to constituents like mine who are paying the dual price of this government's cost of living crisis and mortgage rates crisis?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we've taken significant action to help families across the country, most notably by taxing the windfall profits of energy companies and using that money to pay around half of a typical family, including all of her constituents' energy bills. That support is worth £1,500, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased that energy bills are forecast to fall £430 when the price cap resets in a couple of days. But beyond that, there's considerable support for the most vulnerable in our society, including £900 of cost of living payments for those on universal credit and additional support for pensioners and indeed disabled people, Mr. Speaker, and that's what we'll continue to do.
Bailey.
Speaker, we are heading into the 5th week of Sandwell Labour's refuse strikes. We've had flying pickets, we've had reports of the GMB blocking ambulance workers getting out of their depot as a result of their picket lines, and the PCC trying to encourage the police not to police it. Can I ask my right honourable friend to ensure that he convenes a meeting urgently so we can resolve this, and perhaps he'll join me and tell Labour politicians, particularly one in particular, grow a spine and put people before your paymasters.
We've done very well, don't spoil it now, Prime Minister.
Well, my honourable friend put it very well, but illustrated exactly the issue. Because, Mr. Speaker, the Labour Party is unable to stand up to its union paymasters and back our plans to introduce minimum service and safety levels in critical industries. That's a type of practical action that supports working families. It's one that the Labour Party isn't strong enough to actually support.
Welcome back, Donald.
I'm grateful, Mr. Speaker. After events in Russia at the weekend, it is unclear what the future holds for the Wagner Group. But what can never be washed away is the catalogue of crimes they've committed across Africa, the Middle East and, of course, in Ukraine. But despite all of that, Mr. Speaker, the government doesn't yet have a permanent Cabinet Office official to coordinate all of the organs of government to pursue the criminals in the Wagner Group. Will he appoint one? And crucially, will he fund collecting evidence of Wagner Group war crimes that have been committed across the world so that these criminals, no matter what happens, can be brought to justice in future?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we have consistently condemned the Wagner Group and we carefully monitor their actions in Ukraine and the wider world, as the Honourable gentleman mentions. We have designated both the Wagner Group and its leader under our sanctions regime already, and we also support international mechanisms which hold individual mercenaries in the Wagner Group to account for violations of international law. But I also reassure him that we are working very closely with our partners to counter the malign use of such proxies by Russia and more generally across the continent.
Paul Bristow.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On Monday night, an illegal traveller encampment was established on Bretton Park. On Saturday, the much-loved Bretton Festival is due to take place on Breton Park. This House passed legislation that gives more powers to police to tackle these illegal encampments. Will the Prime Minister make it clear today from the dispatch box that he expects police to use those powers on these encampments that blight public spaces and public parks in places like Peterborough?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we absolutely recognise the misery that unauthorised encampments can cause to local communities, and that's why we've delivered on our manifesto commitment to give police the powers they need to tackle those people on unauthorised encampments who are causing harm. Now, of course, how the police use these powers is an operational matter for chief constables, but we wouldn't have legislated for them if we didn't expect them to use them, Mr. Speaker, and I am told that Home Office officials are liaising regularly with the National Police Chiefs Council on this exact matter.
Final question, Martin Docker to use.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the past couple of days, yet again, we have been reminded that a member of the other House was appointed contrary to the recommendations of MI5. And in the Channel 4 film, that even the monarch was actually asked to be involved because Whitehall officials were so opposed, given that they were deemed a security risk to the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. So can I ask the Prime Minister, does he agree with MI5 or with his predecessor that peer should still be in the other House?
Prime Minister.
If Mr. Speaker, for obvious reasons, I'll talk in more general terms. With the House of Lords Appointment Commission vets crossbench and party political life peerage nominations to the House of Lords, and where appropriate, seeks advice from government departments and agencies, and were a Prime Minister to recommend a peerage against the Commission's formal advice, the House of Lords Appointment Commission has previously undertaken that it would write publicly to the relevant Parliamentary Select Committee.
Completes Prime Minister's questions. Right, let us come to the urgent question. If people can stop the conversation in the middle, will be helpful, Mr. Slaughter. Right, we come to the urgent question. Jim McMahon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To ask the Secretary of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs to make a statement on the financial resilience of the water industry.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Water is what makes life possible on our planet, and it is essential for our health and well-being, as well as our economy, including the production of food and clean energy. The government is taking significant steps to ensure the water industry is delivering the outcomes bill payers expect and deserve. Water companies have invested £190 billion since privatisation in 1989. In April, the government published the Plan for Water, bringing together more investment, stronger regulation and tougher enforcement capacity for regulators and on those who pollute. Ofwat and the government take the financial resilience of the water sector very seriously. Ofwat are the independent economic regulator for the water sector, including responsibility for the financial resilience of the water sector. The sector as a whole is financially resilient. Ofwat continues to monitor the financial position of all the key water and wastewater companies. Ofwat reports annually on the sector's financial resilience, and Ofwat's latest annual Monitoring Financial Resilience report shows that the water sector is financially resilient. Market confidence in the sector is also demonstrated by new acquisitions, such as Pennon's purchase of Bristol Water, and by shareholders being willing to inject new capital. Ofwat has taken steps in recent years to strengthen the sector's position. This includes action to update the ring-fencing provisions in water company licences to better safeguard the interests of customers and barring water companies from making payouts to shareholders and removing money or assets from the business if they lose their investment credit grade rating. Ofwat has outlined that water companies must be transparent about how executive pay and dividends align to delivery of services to customers, including environmental performance. And since privatisation, total capital investment has outstripped dividends by 250%. On the 20th of March 2023, Ofwat announced new powers that will enable it to take enforcement action against water companies that do not link dividend payments to performance for both customers and the environment. And in December 2022, Ofwat strengthens its powers on executive pay awards by setting out that shareholders and not customers will fund pay awards where companies do not demonstrate their decisions or pay awards reflect overall performance. We support Ofwat's work and we urge all water companies to take this opportunity to review their policies. The scale of government commitment for the water industry is highlighted by the Integrated Plan for Water and our commitments to the financial resilience of the sector in delivering for customers and the environment.
Thank you. Jim McMahon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, can I thank you for granting this urgent question, but I have to say, again, it's a concern that the Secretary of State didn't proactively make a statement to the House on an issue of such importance. And I just say, where is the Secretary of State? Literally, one of the largest water companies in Britain potentially is going to go to the wall, and the Secretary of State is missing in action. And it was clear to anyone looking on that a culture that allowed vital investment in ending the sewage scandal and in tackling water leaks sacrificed in favour of a gold rush for shareholders just was never sustainable. Now, just last year, as raw human sewage was being pumped out across the country, £1.4 billion was paid out to shareholders. And now all that was warned is coming to pass. Leaks are leading to water shortages, sewage dumping pollutes our rivers, our lakes, our seas, and the only thing on the up is debt at £60 billion. The Conservative Party cycle of privatising profit, usually for multi-billion-pound foreign sovereign wealth funds, and then nationalising risk, just isn't sustainable, nor is it a fair deal for working people. Now, the news that we're seeing is a result of the Conservative Party's failed profit above public interest experiment, handing over the water industry at a knockdown price, together with the entire infrastructure serving the nation, over to private enterprise. Almost unique, for instance, when rail was privatised, the PRACs weren't sold off. But with water, the lot was handed over with little safeguards for our national interest, our national security or bill payers. So can I ask the Minister, when was her department first made aware of the financial situation at Thames Water? Has her department had any reason to believe that those responsible at Thames Water wouldn't be able to meet their licence obligations or legal obligations? If this means a taxpayer-funded bailout, how much will that cost and how will it be paid for? And what assessment has she made on the liability of UK pension funds who are invested in Thames and other water companies considered at risk? And given where we are, does she confirm today her confidence for the financial regulator? And finally, given what we see with Thames Water today, does she have any concerns about any other water companies, or does she consider this to be an isolated case? Thank you.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And just first of all, in our DEFRA department, we have our individual portfolios. I am the Water Minister, and the Secretary of State has full confidence in her Minister in sending them to the dispatch box. I just want to make the point too, in terms of the debt issue that was raised there by the Shadow Minister. Just for information, debt to equity fell last year by 4% in the water industry, actually making it more resilient, Mr. Speaker. And, just to put it on the record, Since privatisation, capital investment in the water industry has been 84% higher than it was pre-privatisation. So I think we need to get that out there on the table. And in terms of the water company mentioned today, Thames Water, it's not for me to comment on the individual financial position of a water company. We have an independent regulator who is doing that. That is what the regulator Ofwat is indeed for. Water companies are commercial entities, and it is for the company and its investors to resolve any possible issues. And government, of course, is confident that Ofwat, as the economic regulator of the water industry, is working closely with any company that would be facing financial stress.
Chair of the Select Committee, Sir Robert Goodwin.
Thank you. Sewage treatment plants are all too often overwhelmed at times of heavy rain. So as well as installing stormwater tanks like the new 4 million litre stormwater tank in Scarborough, does the Minister agree we should do more to encourage homeowners to harvest grey water, which can buffer the effects of heavy rain, and also use that water for things like flushing their toilets?
I thank him for broadening the scope of the debate. Indeed, we are in discussions with the DULUC department, because a lot of these issues don't just come under DEFRA. We have to work with other departments on this very issue of grey water harvesting and better using the rain that does fall. I've just visited a farmer in Devon, and he was collecting all the water from the roofs of his farm building, which supplied his entire farm with all the water for the animals. So I thank him for his point.
Let us go to Sir Stephen Timms.
Mr. Speaker, in assessing, as she's explained, the resilience of the water industry, what assessment is she making of the impact on UK pension funds if a major company like Thames Water does, as is being widely suggested in the press, if that company fails?
Minister?
I thank him for that. But there is a structure, there is a process for working through this. It's up for the individual water companies and the regulator to work with them to ensure that they are resilient. That is why Ofwat reports annually on how resilient each water company is. And if it flags any issues at all, then Ofwat works very, very closely with that industry, because we need our water companies to be fully functioning. We need to attract the investment, as we have done since privatisation. That huge sum of money that has been invested since privatisation that I just mentioned earlier on, we need that money to be there to invest in the infrastructure, to give our customers the kind of service that they deserve, and also to be mindful that it's just not all piled onto customers. We have to share the load.
A bit more.
Speaker, I think it's worth making the House realise that actually it was the opposition party that voted against the Environment Act, which actually gave Ofwat more powers. So can my right honourable friend assure me that the water regulator Ofwat will be able to clamp down on excessive cash payouts and ensure that water companies put their customers first?
I thank him for pointing that out. It's absolutely right. It doesn't matter what the opposition say today. They didn't vote for all the measures in the Environment Act. And one of those measures was, and I thank him for raising this, that Ofwat will be able to hold water companies to account where they don't demonstrate a link between dividends and performance. They've got to have a sound performance and be performing for their customers. Otherwise, they can't pay out their dividends.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm afraid we're hearing staggering complacency from the Minister on this, and this will come as no comfort to my constituents who were flooded out 3 years ago in the West London floods, which were the second 100-year event in less than a decade. If Ofwat had been doing such a good job as she is now apparently telling us, in holding the government to account, why are we in this situation? What exactly have Ofwat been doing?
I think it has to be remembered that indeed privatisation occurred in 1989, so we've had a succession of different governments during that time, and it's been this government that has really accelerated clamping down on water companies and opening up transparency. So she asks what Ofwat have done, and I'll just name a few things. Since 2020, Ofwat updated the licences so that if a water company loses its investment credit credit rating, it's barred from making payouts to shareholders. Then in July 2022, it set out additional proposals to increase financial resilience, including companies to have a stronger credit rating. And then it's just in March announced that it would take enforcement actions against water companies that do not link dividend payments to performance. So I would say this government has done more than any ever before to make sure we have a fully functioning, very strong regulator.
Philip Dunn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wonder if the Minister, on the subject of financial resilience, has taken the opportunity to consider the hodgepodge of policies coming from the front bench opposite on this subject. Under their prescription, they would seek to take all of the profit of the water companies to invest in capital expenditure. That would undermine the financial resilience of those companies that rely on private capital to invest in order to achieve this problem. And in the one part of the country where they do have responsibility, Wales, has she noticed that the sewerage overflows in Wales are almost double the rate per overflow pipe they are in England?
I thank him for pointing that out, and I couldn't support more strongly what he says. This is a private system. We have Ofwat saying it is financially resilient. We do actually need investment in these companies to make them function properly. Obviously, we need to hold those companies to account, but we need to see that enormous investment that we on this side have a fully costed plan for everything in our plan for water, for our storm sewage overflow reduction plan. And we are not pulling the wool over people's eyes, Mr. Speaker. We are telling them clearly what this will mean, but how it will deliver the water services that we need.
John Cryer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thames Water, which is on the verge of going under, provides a quarter of the entire population with its water supply. When was she told about the financial plight of Thames, and what's the plan if the worst comes to the worst and it does go under?
Minister.
Yes, I thank him for that. And you're right, Thames Water does supply an enormous amount of our population. And obviously, Ofwat has been working closely with Thames Water, as it does all water companies. And government then works with Ofwat. We give Ofwat our strategic policy statement on what are their priorities. Overall, the water companies are considered resilient, but there is a lot of work going on behind the scenes with Thames Water to ensure that customers will not be impacted, and there is a process in place, if necessary, to move us to the next stage.
Sir Robert Battle.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Swindon residents will be very concerned about the future of Thames Water. I would ask my honourable friend to keep me and colleagues updated, please, with regard to any issues relating to that. Underlying this, Labour's model is clearly never going to work. We've got to understand that only the private sector will be able to invest, and the party opposite might bleat now, but they didn't do anything about it when they were in government. The point is this, isn't it? Where you have an effective monopoly, a private monopoly, the regulator has to be as effective as possible. Will she do everything she can to ensure that Ofwat is actually working in a way that's in the full interests of customers, because there are aspects of its operation that do not seem to me to pass that test?
I thank him for that, and I'd like to give assurances, obviously, for his constituents in Swindon. He's right to raise that. It is a big water company. It does deliver on a very wide scale. But Ofwat is working very, very closely with Thames Water on their plans. Plans will be looked over, submitted, accounts submitted in due course, and Ofwat will work with the company so that we do have a resilient pathway, and customers should rest assured that their supplies will be protected, both water and wastewater.
Clive Efford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The situation is that this privatised industry knows that at the end of the day, the banker of last resort is the British taxpayer. Yeah. And that's exactly where we are now with Thames Water. They've been taking profits for the last 35 years and not investing for the future. Regardless of what went on before, it's about investing for the needs that are coming forwards in front of the industry. And they have failed to plan ahead. And they've taken money whilst not doing the job that they were expected to do in charge of such an essential public service. So what is the government going to do to protect consumers and make sure that we plan ahead for this industry.
Well, Ofwat, of course, is the independent regulator, and government directs them through its strategic policy statement, as the honourable member will know. And it's Ofwat's job to ensure that in the price review, when the water companies submit their plans, and they're going over the draft plans right now, that within those plans they can demonstrate that they will deliver the things that government, for example, is setting through all the targets on the storm overflows, on the leakage, on the demand reduction. And it's for Ofwat to ensure the company will be resilient in delivering that infrastructure. There's a firm structure in place, and Ofwat is constantly also monitoring companies' gearing, its debt to equity levels, and we are confident as a government that Ofwat is taking reasonable measures to challenge companies to reduce those gearing levels where appropriate.
Richard Fuller.
Mr. Speaker, about a quarter of the economic output of this country is in sectors that are under regulators, including the water industry. And we've seen both with Ofwat, but also in other sectors with Ofgem, Financial Conduct Authority, where regulators aren't performing to the standards that the public would expect them, or indeed the industry would expect them. And if we're honest, Mr. Speaker, in this House and in Parliament, we do not have the toolkit to assess the performance of regulators on a systemic basis year on, year out. So will my honourable friend work with other ministerial colleagues to see if we can improve the regular oversight of regulators like Ofwat so that we can take a more rounded view of issues such as today, rather than have it come to an urgent question that's brought by the opposition?
I thank him for that, and of course it is absolutely essential that we have fully functioning regulators. He's absolutely right about that. But I would say, in terms of Ofwat, they have done an enormous amount since this government has been in power to streamline what they do, to improve transparency, to change these licences, to make those changes so that dividends aren't paid if there's any environmental damage being caused. And government, with its strategic policy statement, has directed that. And our targets, indeed, will ensure that the regulator has to enable the water companies to put the right measures in place. But he is right, one should never be complacent. And if there are things that do need to be improved through the regulators, then of course those things should happen. But I'm making a big effort.
Many of my constituents in Feltham and Heston are hugely worried about reports of Thames Water being on the brink and what this could mean for their bills. Thames Water has been appallingly managed. Leaks haven't been dealt with, sewage continually dumped, with the former CEO Sarah Bentley needing to be asked to forego her bonus, all the while the government missing in action. So why is the government, yet again, running to catch up, with nothing in the Minister's statement today giving confidence they have a grip, and with our constituents paying the price?
Where water companies underperform and don't meet their targets, there's a process in place where actually they have to basically credit the money back to the customers. And £143 million was credited back in this respect last year. So we do have the tools. The regulator does have the tools to do that. The regulator has tightened up so many of its measures, and all of these will be impacting on all of the water companies.
Robert Coates.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I know that the Minister won't be able to comment on Thames Water's finances in detail, but can she reassure my constituents who will be really worried that whatever happens there, their day-to-day services will be protected and the much-needed upgrades that we need will still be delivered?
Yes, I thank him for that, and he's absolutely right. Of course, customers come first, and I would like to give assurances that the customers of Thames Water will be assured their water supplies and their wastewater services. And if he wants to meet to discuss this, I'm very happy to do that with him.
Manera Wilson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Residents in Twickenham, Teddington and the Hamptons will of course be extremely worried to hear Thames Water is on the brink of collapse, but they're also frankly fed up to the back teeth with this company that not only pumps sewage into our precious River Thames, but also we've seen sewage flooding our streets in recent times of flooding from rainfall, but also now plans to pump treated sewage into the Thames at times of drought. This is indicative of underinvestment by the company in
fixing leaks and being stripped to the bare bones whilst lining the pockets of executives. All the while, the government has been missing in action and the regulator has failed. So will the Minister back proposals by the Liberal Democrats to reform water companies into public good companies, transforming their boards and their priorities in the interests of the environment and consumers?
I will just highlight the Thames Super Sewer, which is almost ready to open in a not too distant future, which is a tremendous project for the people of London, including many of her constituents. And I would also say that we have a system of privatisation. I've already reported that, in fact, its financial resilience has increased over the last year rather than decreasing. We have a system whereby they invest money, they attract really important money in from investors so that we can get what we need. We have costed plans for all this. The Liberal Democrats have no costed plans for what they suggest they might do with the water companies, or indeed where the money is going to come from.
Duncan Beck.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's probably worth pointing out to the parties opposite that actually 93% of all of our UK coastal bathing waters meet good or excellent conditions. Now, actually, in North Norfolk, we have lost 3 blue flag beaches, which went from excellent to good. But guess what? There is not a single reason why they lost that flag, and under the Environment Agency's marking, it looks like it's not down to combined sewage overflows, but entirely natural phenomena. So could the Minister help me, A, get my blue flags back, and secondly, hold the Environment Agency to task so we have a proper testing regime that transparently shows that we have excellent bathing water quality all over North Norfolk?
Well done, Duncan.
I thank him very much for raising the issue of the bathing water quality, because since privatisation, of course, we do have almost or virtually the best quality water coming out of our taps almost anywhere in the world, but we also have these phenomenal results for our bathing water areas, 93% being classed as good or excellent. I know that he has concerns about his own areas. I hope they will soon be back up to blue flag status. The Environment Agency works very, very closely if there are individual cases where concerns have been highlighted, and I'm happy to put him in touch with them or just to work with him to find out what those individual cases were so that we can get them back up to that fantastic standard that they deserve.
And this lot.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Today, not for the first time, most of my constituents have little or no water supply. 2 years ago, not for the first time, hundreds of my constituents had their homes flooded with raw sewage. Year after year, Thames Water has failed its customers while obscenely rewarding its management and shareholders. No one will miss the asset strippers at Thames Water if they go under. All we want is working infrastructure and good customer service at a reasonable cost. Is that too much to ask?
Obviously it is.
Of course, that is what we want for all of our customers, and that is why we've indeed launched our plan for water to ensure that we deal with any pollution incidents, we deal with water supply issues, and we deal with the future of the water industry, pulling everything together. And that is why we've set all our targets and why we produced our storm sewage overflow plan, and why the water companies are going to have to spend £56 billion of capital investment by 2050 to address this. Every water company, including Thames, has got to do an action plan for each of their storm sewage overflows, and that is what Thames Water will do.
Dame Ansley.
Very much, Mr. Speaker. When they were privatised, water companies had all the debt written off, so they started with zero. Since then, they've borrowed £53 billion, and much of this has been used to help pay £72 billion in dividends. The investment has been made by borrowing and put onto customers' bills. And now S&P, the rating agency, has negative outlooks for 2/3 of the UK water companies it rates because they're over-leveraged and they've taken out too much debt in an era of low interest rates, which they're now having to pay. This is not a triumph. It's actually a huge problem for the resilience of our water industry. And what is the Minister going to do when water companies start falling over?
Just for information, Thames Water itself hasn't paid any dividends for the last 6 years. And Ofwat quite rightly, will hold companies to account where they don't clearly demonstrate the link between dividends and performance, and we made that possible, obviously, through the landmark Environment Act.
Caroline Lucas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would just like to bring the Minister back to the figures that we've just heard, that water companies had no debt when they were privatised, since when they have borrowed £53 billion, and much of that has been used to help pay the £72 billion in dividends. Meanwhile, we have this appalling sewage scandal, particularly in the southeast of England. We have a failing water company, the Southern Water Company, that my constituents have no choice but to rely on, and it's considering raising bills by £279 per year by 2030, largely to pay for the investment that they should have been making in the previous years. Doesn't that just show that privatisation of water was a serious mistake and it needs to be permanently rectified?
What I would say is that privatisation has enabled clean and plentiful water to come out of our taps. And it's actually unlocked £190 billion of funding to invest in the industry. That's the equivalent of £5 billion annually. That's double what we had pre-privatisation. I'm not saying that there is not a lot of scope where improvements can still be made, and I've stood at this dispatch box many times, as has the Secretary of State, to say some of the actions of water companies are completely unacceptable, and that's why we've introduced all our targets, why we've introduced the storm overflow plan, and why we've introduced our plan for water.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As has already been said by two previous speakers, the issue of funding and loans to the water companies has been huge, and that's where they've been paying their dividends from. The issue of shareholders is that we have foreign investors taking huge amounts of money away from this country, and also in terms of pension funds, what we need is better fund managers who are able to assess where they're putting their money, and they should be held accountable too as well. Ofwat has not been doing what it's supposed to do. The current Chief Executive, I believe, of Ofwat is going to be applying for the job of Thames Water, and that shows where the companies are looking at to do and how Ofwat works and how closely it works. Rather than scrutinising them, is looking for the next job, and that's what we have to stop. We need to stop my constituents paying more for water and to be allowed to have decent water in their decent homes and in the environments around them, and that's what we want the government to do. This is a Tory policy that has failed over years.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Not sure what the question was there, Mr. Speaker. We want the same things. We want good value for customers. We want clean and plentiful water. We want to hold the water companies to account. We want them to invest the money that we need to deliver these services. And that's why we've got a plan for water. That's why we've got targets. That's why we brought through the measures in the Environment Act. And that's why Ofwat, the regulator, has taken all of the actions that I've previously named to increase transparency on the water companies and to ensure that money is not being paid out if there's any environmental impact or performance negativity in their company.
Thank you,
Mr. Speaker. In the last year, a number of my constituents on the Westfield estate have had their homes and their gardens flooded by raw sewage. Yorkshire Water accept it's their sewage, but they don't accept it's their responsibility to help with the clean-up. Will the Minister look at the legal position to ensure that water companies are held accountable in this case, and in the meantime we should put pressure on Yorkshire Water and others to pay for the clean-up that my constituents are now having to fund themselves?
Of course, you'll know we have put huge pressure on the water companies because they've now got to invest £56 billion in infrastructure to deal with sewage issues. If he does want to meet with you separately just to talk about that one issue, I'm happy to do it.
Dan Jarvis.
Back in January, I asked the Water Minister if she thought the current system of regulation was fit for purpose, and she said yes. So can I ask her again today, does she still think the system of water regulation is fit for purpose?
Yes.
Rebecca Longberry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Water companies were sold with no debt and they were privatised in 1989. In fact, they were given a green dowry by the government of £1.5 billion. However, since then, these companies have taken on borrowings of £60.6 billion, diverting income from customer bills to pay dividends and interest payments. And as a result, water bills have increased by upwards of 40% in real terms. Does the Minister honestly think that consumers hail privatisation as a success?
Well, actually, ultimately, it is customers that pay for investment in the industry, but they pay this over a very long period of time, as she will know. And if a company didn't pay out dividends, it would struggle to get access to the finance to fund future investment, and it would limit the level of investment and impact on future customers. So that's why customers, they have to pay upfront for a lot of this investment. They need to secure large amounts of funding to pay for this, and to avoid customer bills increasing drastically to pay for this, companies have to secure the money by raising debt or equity. She knows how it works. The regulator just has to ensure that system is fully functioning and that the water companies are resilient, but also we have all the resilient water supplies we require.
It's been reported that the water companies are drawing up their business plans for 2025 to 2030, and on average they're going to be looking at a 25% increase in bills. Given what we've heard today, wouldn't bill payers in my constituency just think that having to pay extra to water companies, they might as well just be flushing their money down the drain for all the good that it will do in terms of improved water quality, improved services and investment in infrastructure?
Yeah, those plans are all being assessed right now. The draft plans are going into Ofwat. They're analysed with a very fine tooth comb, and all of the things that I've mentioned today will be obviously scrutinised so that we can deliver the infrastructure that is needed. We have the clean and plentiful water supplies we require, and the clean environment and healthy environment, and that there isn't an undue impact on customer bills. All of those things have to be taken into account to deliver the water supplies that I believe the people we go out and meet and the people we serve in our jobs deserve.
Mick Whitley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The British public should not be asked to cover the costs of failures of the water monopolies and its shareholders, which have borrowed extensively to pay dividends while failing to make the necessary investments in infrastructure and resilience. Does the Minister agree with me that if the government is compelled to take water Does the Minister agree with me that if the government is compelled to take Thames Water into public ownership, then it should stay in public hands?
Minister.
Well, I'm not aware of the situation he's referring to there. Ofwat's working very, very closely with Thames Water to ensure that there is a viable business there, to ensure that customers are not impacted, and to ensure that the water supply services and the wastewater services are still delivered. And Ofwat have strengthened, as I have mentioned, so many measures so that we have a much more resilient industry in future, and indeed that changing and lowering of the debt to equity level demonstrates that we do have a more resilient industry.
Richard Ford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've seen bonuses and dividends put ahead of investment in infrastructure or maintaining sufficient reserves. In our own area, the Devon and Somerset, covered by South West Water, that company has paid out £112 million in dividends this year, despite having just £144 million in reserves, £2.5 billion less in reserves than 2 years ago. This week we've had one water firm CEO resign, but no Conservative minister has ever taken responsibility. When will a Conservative minister finally take responsibility and get a grip, or step aside?
As he knows, Ofwat have announced new measures to enable it to take enforcement action against water companies that don't link dividend payments to performance. I mean, that's just not happening. I think he needs to look at some of the stats he's just quoted, because I think that they might relate to the wider Pennon Group. And I've just been down there to visit South West Water to have a really forensic look at their systems and how they deliver water. And that is what we do with our water companies. That is actually Ofwat's role and Ofwat's job, to hold water companies into account. And they've actually just taken measures in place through Treasury so that they've got another £11.3 million to tackle enforcement.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Minister for her answers to the questions? Ever mindful that house building is important, development opportunities are critical for the future as well. So with developers being charged more and more to connect to the network and then faced with delays for those very connections, what plans has the Minister to introduce affordability to the sector connection system for any new developments?
Okay, thank you very much for that. Of course, he raises an important issue, and we always have to be mindful of costs, not just to customers through their bills, but also developers building houses. We're actually working very closely with the DULUC department on a whole range of measures and on their planning guidance as well, so that we are able to tackle a whole range of issues connected with water, including things like the rainwater harvesting, which we can work along with developments with, and SUDs as well, which will really help the whole of our water infrastructure.
What's the point of order, Mr. Speaker?
Is it actually on this? John Cryer, point of order.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think the Minister may have inadvertently misled the House, because she said clearly that Thames Water have not been paying out dividends. The reality is Thames Water have not been paying out dividends in the usual way, but they did pay a dividend last year to the parent company, so they have been paying out dividends.
Minister, I don't know whether you'd like to respond, please.
I'll thank him to that. Certainly, I would just check out the wordings. I would hate to mislead the House, Mr. Speaker. And if there's something I've said that was inadvertently incorrect, I'm happy to put that straight on the record.
Right. Sorry. I'll just let those clear before we come to the statement. We now come to the statement. I call the Secretary of State, Stephen Bartley.